We are so honored today to have Dr. Walter Brueggemann as our preacher and as our scholar in residence for the weekend. He was actually our very first scholar in residence some 11 years ago. Jack McClendon, who gave us the bequest that has funded the program all these years, was alive then and got to know Walter, in fact visited him in Atlanta. And now he lives in Cincinnati. Many years he was professor of Old Testament at Columbia Theological Seminary, before that at Eden Theological Seminary. At least in some people's opinion, in my opinion, the most noted biblical scholar of this era. He has written 100 books, over 100. Now think about that. Now you've got to think that some of those are better than others, right? But actually, you read them, and there's an evenness to them that's quite remarkable. Many of them are commentaries, and I'm surprised how many of them I have in my library. I looked at home, and I looked here, and I have a whole bunch of them, but especially the commentaries. Now nobody reads a commentary right straight through, or well, you can do that, but typically preachers will read only sections of them. And it is remarkable how much insight a preacher like me can get from his commentaries. In a day when too many theologians are speaking to themselves and biblical scholars are speaking to themselves, Walter Brueggemann speaks to the church, and he speaks to culture. He speaks to America. He speaks to the world, and it is a prophetic voice. And we're so honored, Walter, to have you as our preacher on Reformation Sunday.
Thank you. Good. Thank you. Okay. All right. The third lesson, gospel reading, is from Matthew 22, beginning at verse 34, which is on page 24 of the New Testament in the Pew Bible, page 24. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" He said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." Now, while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them this question: "What do you think of the Messiah? Whose son is he?" And they said, "The son of David." He said to them, "How is it then that David by the Spirit calls him Lord, saying, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet'? If David thus calls him Lord, how can he be his son?" No one was able to give him an answer, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions at all. Grace to you and peace in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. I am so glad to get to be here to think with you about our faith, and I am so glad to be remembering Jack McClendon this morning, who gave us this great gift. Reformation Sunday is a time to think about evangelical chutzpah. I could have said gospel chutzpah, because the word evangelical means gospel, but I thought you might not notice if I said gospel chutzpah, so I said evangelical chutzpah. What turned out to be Reformation Day in 1517, 500 years ago, when this unknown monk, Martin Luther, exercised a great deal of chutzpah in which he proposed for debate a whole theological argument that challenged the church and issued a wake-up call to the church. It turned out that his argument that day when he posted it set in motion a theological revolution that unsettled the church and eventually unsettled all of Christian Europe. Before him, the Apostle Paul was also filled with chutzpah. It took as much chutzpah to be an apostle as it took to be a reformer, because apostles are sent to speak God's truth in a world that is not particularly welcoming of God's truth. So the Apostle Paul went into the Roman Empire and spoke this dangerous word of the gospel. And Martin Luther spoke this dangerous word of the gospel to the church that turned out to be not very receptive. In 1 Thessalonians, which is our epistle reading, you may know that 1 Thessalonians is commonly thought to be Paul's earliest letter. Paul reviews what it's like for him to have apostolic chutzpah. He writes, I was shamefully treated in Philippi because I am an apostle, but I didn't shrink from it. I declared the gospel against great opposition. I was approved by God, even though I didn't have any human approval. And I related to you in ways that were gentle. I treated you as kindly as a nurse. He said, I'm a brave man, and I'm a good man, and I'm an honest man, and the gospel is what matters. Now, I tell you this about the chutzpah of this reformer and the chutzpah of this apostle, because I believe we live in a moment when great chutzpah is required to live a life that is faithful to our gospel baptism. There was a time not very long ago when the church was kind of timid and thought we could get by without anybody noticing. We thought we could accommodate Enlightenment rationality, and we thought we could accommodate the narrative of militarism that is all around us in our society, and we thought we could cooperate with the narrative of consumerism and help people be happy, and it sounded so much like the prosperity gospel. Well, it turns out all of those narratives are false, and now it is a time when we must assert the truth of the gospel narrative with enormous nerve and courage and freedom and imagination. Paul writes to this church at Thessalonica, he says, I was determined to preach the gospel to you, and the gospel that Paul gave them was the good news that God's love is generous and that God's grace is without limit. It turned out to be incredibly good news in Martin Luther's Germany, because they had been nurtured in a church like the one in the children's sermon that wanted to do transactions for God's grace if you could afford it. And so the churches of the Reformation in Germany are still called evangelical churches. That means gospel churches, which means they don't count on the church, they don't count on the state, they don't count on ideologies, liberal or conservative, but they believe only in the truth of God's incredible generosity. So it is the work of the Reformation in Reformed churches like this one to give an account of a limitless generosity of God that overcomes all our fears. Our fear of running out, our fear of not being good enough, our fear of not having done enough, our fear of not owning enough, or achieving enough or controlling enough. Because the news is that God's perfect love casts out fear. And when fear is casted out, we can have very different kinds of neighborly relationships. And when fear is cast out, we can have very different kinds of public policies, because we can be generous with the resources we have and make sure that all of the neighbors are included in the generosity of God. We know in this narrative that peace does not come through arms and strength to dominate. We know that viable community does not depend on control and domination. So we are in the business of echoing this old Torah teaching of Leviticus that we read. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. So let me tell you a story about Shane. Shane is a pastor who was about 35 years old. He was a pastor in a very authoritarian church tradition, and he thought he had to be authoritarian. And he came to me one day, I had never known him before, because he wanted to tell me that he hated being a minister. And he was so angry at the church. And I had the wisdom to suggest to him that maybe he wasn't supposed to be a minister, that maybe that wasn't his vocation. And what happened in the next 6 months is that he and his wife and their 3 small children sold what little property they had. They got in their car and they drove to upstate New York, and they'd been living in her parents' garage, and they'd been living in poverty with almost no income. And Shane told me that his children have never been happier because they got their dad back. And what has happened over time, over a year now, is that Shane got a job from the Episcopalians who pay him, and he asked them what his job description would be. And the Episcopalian said, your job is to work with these 30 war-wounded veterans to help them see that the warrior narrative they learned is not true, but that they are loved and that they belong in society. Some job, huh? So what's happening is that these vets, these war-wounded vets, along with Shane, are learning that the old story of their life is not true, the warrior story. That's what happened to Paul. He discovered that the story of the distorted Torah was not the true story of his life. And that's what happened to Luther. He discovered that the quid pro quo story of the money-collecting church was not the true story of his life. So one of the mysteries of Reformation is that in God's grace, we have a chance to unlearn stories in our lives that are not true. The warrior narrative is not true. The white supremacist narrative is not true. The narrative of male privilege is not true. The narrative of consumer prosperity is not true. The narrative of American priority is not true. The narrative of being less than adequate is not true. Because what's going on among us, whether we say it or not, is that there are many narratives floating around among us that are not true. And every one of these narratives have in common that it's important to be first, it's important to be best, it's important to be strongest. And the good news of the Reformation is that you don't have to count on any of these stories. What happened to Shane is that he had inhaled a narrative of fear about being good enough, and all that happened to him is that he got angry. So he had to unlearn the false story of his life, and Paul had to unlearn, and Luther had to unlearn. And what all of these people discovered is that when they unlearned the false narratives of their life and moved into the true narrative of God's goodness, the pressure lifted, the anger dissipated, the fear dissolved, and Shane could discover that he could live happily with his family on very few resources. Paul says more in this amazing letter that we almost never study. He writes, "We are determined to share with you not only the gospel of God, but to share also ourselves." Paul understood that the truth of the gospel is not a cognitive truth. It's not a proposition or a mantra or a slogan or a certitude, but it is a relationship. It is embodied truth. So the gospel is carried by gracious persons who form gracious communities who generate generous policies. I've been reading a lot about austerity lately. You know, the kind of austerity that Germany imposes on Greece because it's afraid that Greece will spend too many German marks. So Angela Merkel wants to be austere. It's a kind of austerity that imposes a work requirement on people who get food stamps because they ought to not get it free. It's a kind of austerity that we impose on undeserving people so to be sure they don't get too much free health care. And what the literature shows is that austerity is not an economic enterprise like balancing the books, but austerity is a moral argument that the haves impose upon the have-nots, poor people, needy single mothers, the Greek economy, in order to get people like that straightened out so that they act right and so they act more like us. It is a matter of imposing what Luther called the law to get people organized in a good way, the way we want them. And then Paul came to know what Luther came to know, what Shane is coming to know, that the gospel of God is not about parsimony, it's not about austerity, it is about generosity. So Paul can write about this God who can do far more abundantly than all we can. Isn't that a wonderful phrase? Far more abundantly than all that we can imagine. So Paul says, I determined to share myself with you. That is what Shane is doing. And whatever Shane does, what really matters in that interaction is that Shane is giving his emancipated self away so that the gospel takes bodily, truthful expression. And the vets are blessed by Shane because they experience in him freedom from anger and a kind of an easy generosity that is able to give itself away. So Paul writes, I give myself to you because you have become very dear to me. That's what happens when we give ourselves away to other people. They become very dear to us. So I speak to you about evangelical chutzpah, the nerve of living out the gospel in a society that does not want the gospel lived out because it's too generous. It is the chutzpah of the apostle. It is the chutzpah of the reformer. And I suspect it is the chutzpah of this great church. We are in process of giving ourselves away because we have been able to put our lives down in this true narrative of God's bottomless generosity to us. Imagine that. This is the great truth of the Reformation, and we are the people who get to live it out. It is incredible news for people like us. Amen.